What happens when a routine daytime television interview suddenly takes an unexpected turn, and a Hollywood star decides he is no longer willing to simply smile, nod, and move on? What happens when a question that seems harmless at first touches a subject that has been quietly building tension beneath the surface, until one calm response changes the entire atmosphere of the studio? And what happens when Mark Wahlberg, sitting across from Whoopi Goldberg and the rest of the panel, decides to push back in a way that nobody in the audience was prepared for? Before we get into this story, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, like this video, and comment below with your thoughts. Because this story is about to take a conversation that appears ordinary and turn it into a moment filled with tension, disagreement, and an unexpected exchange that leaves everyone wondering what will happen next. The studio was already buzzing before the cameras went live. The audience had settled into their seats. The stage lights were glowing brightly against the familiar backdrop, and the hosts were preparing for another fast-moving conversation filled with jokes, opinions, and the kind of spontaneous moments that daytime television was known for. At the center of the attention was Mark Wahlberg. The actor had arrived with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating Hollywood interviews. He had been through press tours, red carpets, late-night appearances, and countless questions about his career. He knew how these conversations worked. Smile. Listen. Answer. Move on. But this time, something felt different. Across the table sat Whoopi Goldberg, watching him carefully. Beside her were the other panelists, each ready to contribute to the conversation. The atmosphere was light at first. There were smiles from the audience, casual laughter, and the familiar rhythm of a daytime talk show. Whoopi leaned slightly forward. "So, Mark," she began, her voice calm and conversational, "you've been in this business for a long time. You've played all kinds of characters, worked with some of the biggest names in Hollywood, and you've obviously learned a lot along the way." Mark smiled. "That's one way of putting it," he replied. The audience laughed. Whoopi smiled back. For a few seconds, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then she continued, "But do you ever look back at the person you were when you first started and wonder if you've changed?" The question sounded simple, almost harmless. Mark paused. He looked toward Whoopi, then briefly toward the audience. "I think everybody changes," he said. "You'd hope so." There was another small wave of laughter. But Whoopi wasn't finished. "Of course," she said. "But sometimes people change because life forces them to. Sometimes they change because they realize they were wrong about something." The energy shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible. But Mark noticed it. The audience noticed it too. Whoopi's expression remained composed, but her question carried a little more weight than the one before it. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well," he said, "I think that's true for everybody." Whoopi nodded. "Absolutely." For a moment, it seemed like the conversation would move on. But then she added another question. "And do you think celebrities sometimes get too comfortable because they're surrounded by people who are afraid to tell them the truth?" The studio became quieter. Mark's smile faded slightly. Not completely. Just enough to show that the question had landed differently. One of the panelists shifted in her seat. The audience waited. Mark looked at Whoopi. "I think that can happen," he said. "Have you ever been in that position?" Whoopi asked. Mark raised his eyebrows. "What position?" "Where everybody around you is telling you that you're right, even when maybe you're not." A few people in the audience reacted with quiet murmurs. Mark smiled again, but this time the expression was more controlled. "Sure," he said. "I've been wrong before." Whoopi nodded. "That's good to hear." And that was the moment when something changed. Mark's expression tightened. He had answered the question. He had admitted that he had been wrong. But there was something about the way the conversation was unfolding that made him feel as though he was being pushed toward a conclusion he didn't agree with. He leaned forward. "Can I ask you something?" he said. The studio went still. Whoopi looked at him. "Sure." Mark glanced around the table. "Why does this suddenly sound like I'm being asked to defend my entire life?" A few audience members laughed nervously. The panelists looked at one another. Whoopi didn't laugh. Instead, she calmly replied, "I'm not asking you to defend your life. That's what it feels like." "No," Whoopi said. "I'm asking you a question. And I'm answering. Then what's the problem?" Mark paused. The audience was now completely focused on the exchange. There was no laughter. No side conversation. Just the sound of two people trying to determine where the conversation was going. Mark took a breath. "The problem," he said, is that sometimes a question can come with an assumption attached to it. Whoopi's expression changed slightly. What assumption? That because someone is famous, they must have something to apologize for. A murmur moved through the audience. Whoopi leaned back. I didn't say that. No, Mark replied. But that's how it sounds. One of the other hosts attempted to lighten the mood. Okay, we're getting deep this morning. A few audience members laughed. But the tension remained. Mark looked toward the host. I'm fine, he said. I'm just saying what I think. Whoopi nodded. And you're allowed to do that. Exactly. Just like I'm allowed to ask questions. Absolutely. The two stared at each other for a brief moment. Neither was shouting. Neither was visibly angry. And somehow, that made the moment even more intense. Because the disagreement wasn't explosive. It was controlled, measured, and beneath the calm voices was the unmistakable feeling that both sides believed they had a point. Whoopi folded her hands on the table. Mark, I've been doing this for a very long time, she said. I've had conversations with people from every part of the entertainment industry. I ask questions because I'm interested in the answers. Mark nodded. I understand that. But sometimes, Whoopi continued, people don't like questions when the answers make them uncomfortable. The audience reacted immediately. A few gasps. A few scattered claps. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. Or, he replied, sometimes people don't like questions because the question itself is unfair. The reaction was stronger this time. A wave of applause moved through the studio. Whoopi looked toward the audience, then back at Mark. Unfair? Yeah. What was unfair about my question? Mark took a second before answering. You're asking me if I've changed. You're asking me if I've been wrong. You're asking me if people around me are afraid to tell me the truth. He paused. That's 3 questions that already assume something about me. Whoopi's expression became more serious. Maybe I'm asking because I want to know. Then ask me directly. The studio fell silent. Mark leaned slightly closer to the table. Don't ask me a question that already tells me what the answer is supposed to be. That sentence hung in the air. The audience was silent. Whoopi stared at him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then she slowly nodded. Okay, she said. The word was quiet. Almost too quiet. But Mark wasn't finished. I respect you, he said. I really do. But respect goes both ways. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted. Are you saying I don't respect you? No, because that's what it sounds like. I'm saying I don't think respect means agreeing with everything someone says. Whoopi leaned forward. Neither do I. Then we're good. Maybe. The audience reacted with nervous laughter. Mark smiled slightly, but Whoopi remained serious. And then she asked the question that would push the conversation even further. If you believe that, Mark, why does it bother you when someone challenges you? Mark's smile disappeared. The room became still again. This time, there was no easy way around the question. Mark looked at Whoopi, then at the audience, then back at Whoopi. His answer came slowly. It doesn't bother me to be challenged. He paused. What bothers me is when people decide who I am before they ever hear what I have to say. The audience erupted into applause. Whoopi sat quietly. Mark's words had clearly connected with the room. But instead of backing away, Whoopi nodded thoughtfully. That's fair. Mark seemed surprised. Thank you. But, Whoopi continued, I still think people have a right to question public figures. Of course. And sometimes, she said, the questions are uncomfortable because the world is uncomfortable. Mark nodded slowly. That's true. Then maybe we're not as far apart as you think. The tension eased. Just slightly. But the audience could still feel that something had happened. A simple interview had become something much more complicated. What had started as a discussion about personal growth had turned into a debate about celebrity, accountability, assumptions, and the responsibility of public figures to answer difficult questions. And as the cameras continued rolling, Mark Wahlberg sat across from Whoopi Goldberg with an expression that suggested the conversation was far from over. Because now, the entire studio was waiting for one thing. The next question. And nobody knew whether it would finally calm the tension, or take it somewhere even more unexpected. The studio remained unusually quiet after Mark's last answer. For a moment, it seemed as though everyone was waiting for the conversation to reset itself. The audience had just witnessed a surprisingly direct exchange, but neither Mark nor Whoopi appeared ready to simply laugh it off and move forward. Whoopi sat back in her chair. Mark remained still. The cameras continued capturing every expression. Then one of the panelists tried to steer the conversation toward Mark's career, asking about the lessons he had learned over the years and whether becoming a husband and father had changed the way he approached his work. It was the kind of question that should have brought the interview back to familiar territory. Mark smiled. Absolutely, he said. When you have a family, your priorities change. You start thinking about things differently. The audience responded warmly. For a few seconds, the atmosphere softened. Mark spoke about responsibility, discipline, and the importance of being present for the people closest to him. His voice became more relaxed, and the audience appeared to settle back into the comfortable rhythm of a celebrity interview. But Whoopi was listening. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't smiling as much as before. She was simply watching him. Mark noticed. He turned toward her. What? Whoopi smiled. Nothing. That doesn't look like nothing. The audience laughed. Whoopi shook her head. I'm listening. You're always listening. That's my job. Sometimes I think you're waiting. For what? Mark smiled. For the moment when you can ask the next question. The audience laughed again. This time Whoopi laughed too. Well, maybe I am. The tension seemed to disappear. But it hadn't. Not completely. Because beneath the laughter, both of them knew that the earlier disagreement was still sitting there. Waiting. Whoopi eventually leaned forward again. You said something interesting a minute ago, she said. Mark immediately looked at her. Here we go. The audience laughed. Whoopi smiled. You said that when you have a family, your priorities change. Yes. Do you think that also changes the way you respond to criticism? Mark thought about it. Maybe. How? Because you realize that everything you do doesn't just affect you. Whoopi nodded. Exactly. Mark continued. When you're younger, you can make a mistake and think, I'll deal with it. When you have a family, you understand that your decisions can affect people who didn't make those decisions with you. The audience grew quiet. It was a thoughtful answer. Whoopi nodded. That's what I'm talking about. Mark's expression changed. About what? Accountability. Mark paused. There it was again. That word. Accountability. The same subject that had been sitting beneath the conversation from the beginning. Mark leaned back. Okay. Whoopi looked at him. What's wrong with accountability? Nothing. Then why do you sound uncomfortable? I'm not uncomfortable. You're doing it again. Doing what? You're answering the question, but you're also defending yourself. Mark looked genuinely surprised. Because you're making it personal. I'm not. You are. The audience became quiet again. Whoopi tilted her head. How? Mark took a breath. You asked me about accountability. Fine. I'm all for it. But then you keep connecting it back to me personally, as if there's something specific I'm supposed to confess. Whoopi shook her head. I never asked you to confess anything. Then what are we doing? We're having a conversation. Mark looked around the table. Does this feel like a conversation to you? The question landed heavily. The audience reacted with a mixture of surprise and nervous laughter. Whoopi's expression became more serious. Yes. Mark nodded slowly. Okay. Why wouldn't it? Because I feel like every time I answer one question, another one comes with a hidden accusation. The room went silent. One of the panelists looked toward Whoopi. Another looked toward Mark. The cameras moved between their faces. Whoopi didn't immediately respond. Instead, she studied Mark carefully. Then she said, Maybe that's because you're expecting an accusation. Mark's eyebrows lifted. Or maybe I'm hearing one. See? See what? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Mark leaned forward. Then explain it to me. Whoopi paused. The audience was completely focused now. You're a public figure, she said. People are going to have opinions about you. Some will be fair. Some won't. Some will ask questions you don't like. I know. Then why not just answer them? I am answering them. Sometimes. Mark gave a small laugh. Sometimes. Whoopi nodded. Yes. Mark shook his head. That's the problem. What? You've already decided I don't answer questions. I didn't say that. You implied it. No, I said sometimes. That's the same thing. The audience reacted again. This time there was no laughter. Mark's voice had become firmer. Whoopi's remained calm. That contrast made the moment feel even more intense. Two different personalities. Two different approaches. Mark was speaking from a place of frustration. Whoopi appeared determined not to let the conversation become personal. But the more they tried to clarify their positions, the more complicated the exchange became. Finally, Whoopi raised one hand slightly. Okay. Mark stopped. Okay, what? Let's start over. Mark stared at her. Start over? Yes. Whoopi smiled faintly. I'll ask you a question. You answer it. No assumptions. No accusations. Just an answer. Mark considered the offer. Fair enough. Whoopi nodded. Do you think celebrities should be held to a higher standard than ordinary people? Mark answered almost immediately. No. The audience reacted. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. No. No. Why not? Because celebrities are people too. But they have influence. Yes. They have platforms. Yes. They can affect public opinion. Absolutely. Then why shouldn't they be held to a higher standard? Mark paused. Because I think everybody should be held accountable for their actions. Whoopi nodded. That's not the same thing. It is to me. How? Because I don't think being famous automatically makes you more responsible than someone else. Mark leaned forward. If you hurt somebody, you should answer for it. If you lie, you should answer for it. If you make a mistake, you should own it. That applies to everyone. Whoopi listened. And if you're famous, then more people might see it. Exactly. But that doesn't mean the standard should be different. Whoopi looked toward the audience. You hear what he's saying? A few people applauded. Mark nodded. That's what I'm saying. But, Whoopi continued, there is a difference between making a private mistake and making a mistake when millions of people are watching. Mark considered that. I agree with that. Then we agree. Maybe. The audience laughed. This time Mark smiled. Whoopi smiled too. But then Mark added something. I just don't think every disagreement needs to become a public trial. The laughter stopped. Whoopi's expression became serious. Nobody said anything about a trial. That's what it can feel like. To you. Yes. Because you're the one sitting in the chair. Mark nodded. Exactly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Whoopi leaned closer. Mark, do you think public figures sometimes use the idea of being misunderstood to avoid criticism? The room changed instantly. Mark's eyes narrowed. There it was. Again. Another question. Another opening. And this time, Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked down. His fingers moved slightly against the edge of the table. The audience waited. The cameras remained fixed on him. Finally, he looked up. Yes. Whoopi nodded. Good. But, Mark continued, I also think sometimes people use criticism as an excuse to avoid listening. Whoopi stopped. Mark continued. Criticism can be useful. But criticism doesn't automatically make someone right. A few audience members applauded. Whoopi nodded slowly. That's true. And I think that's what you're missing. The studio went completely silent. Whoopi stared at him. What am I missing? Mark paused. I think you're assuming that because you're asking the question, you're automatically on the right side of the conversation. Whoopi's expression changed. The audience reacted immediately. A few people gasped. Someone near the front whispered something. Mark sat back. Whoopi remained still. The other hosts looked toward her. For the first time since the conversation began, it seemed as though Mark had pushed the disagreement into territory that even he hadn't expected. Whoopi took a breath. Do you think I assume that? Sometimes. The audience erupted into a mixture of applause and surprised reactions. Whoopi slowly nodded. Okay. Mark looked at her. I didn't mean. No, she interrupted gently. It's okay. But there was something different in her voice now. The lightness was gone. The playful tone had disappeared. She wasn't angry. At least, not visibly. But she was clearly thinking about what he had just said. Then she looked directly at him. Let me ask you something else. Mark smiled slightly. Of course. Do you think there's a difference between being challenged and being attacked? Absolutely. What's the difference? Mark answered carefully. Intent. Whoopi nodded. Explain. If someone challenges me because they genuinely want to understand something, I'll listen. If someone challenges me because they've already decided I'm wrong and just want me to admit it, that's different. Whoopi watched him. That's a pretty fine line. It can be. How do you know which one it is? You don't always know. Then what do you do? Mark paused. You listen anyway. Whoopi smiled. That's a good answer. Mark nodded. Thank you. But do you always do that? The audience laughed. Mark closed his eyes for a second. Oh, come on. The entire studio burst into laughter. Even Whoopi laughed. The tension finally broke. For a few seconds, everyone was smiling. Mark shook his head. See? That's exactly what I'm talking about. Whoopi laughed. I'm just asking. And I'm just answering. The atmosphere became lighter. But the moment had already changed the interview. The audience had seen something unexpected. Not a screaming match. Not an explosive confrontation. Something more complicated. A disagreement between two people who were both determined to make their point without completely losing control of the conversation. And just when it appeared that the interview might finally settle down, Whoopi glanced toward her notes. Mark noticed. His expression changed immediately. Wait, Whoopi looked up. What? Are there more questions? She smiled. Of course. Mark looked toward the audience. The crowd laughed. Everybody, we're in trouble. The laughter grew louder. Whoopi shook her head. You came here to talk. I thought I came here to promote a movie. You can do both. Apparently. The audience applauded. But Whoopi wasn't looking at her notes anymore. She was looking directly at Mark. And Mark could see it. She had another question. A serious one. Something that had clearly been waiting in the background. Whoopi leaned forward. One last thing. Mark sighed dramatically. The audience laughed. That's what everyone says before asking 5 more questions. Whoopi smiled. No, this one is different. Mark's expression became curious. Okay. Whoopi paused. The cameras moved closer. The audience leaned forward. And then she asked a question that would bring the entire conversation back to the issue they had been circling since the beginning. Do you think people deserve forgiveness when they admit they've changed? Mark's face became serious. This time, there was no hesitation. Yes. Whoopi watched him. Even if they don't agree with everything they've done in the past? Yes. Even if other people aren't ready to forgive them? Mark nodded. Yes. Why? Mark looked toward the audience. Then back at Whoopi. Because if people aren't allowed to change, then what's the point of changing? The studio fell silent. Whoopi didn't interrupt. Mark continued. People make mistakes. People grow. People learn. And sometimes people spend years trying to become better than who they were before. He paused. If we refuse to believe anyone can change, then we're not asking for accountability anymore. We're asking people to remain trapped forever in the worst version of themselves. The audience erupted. This time, the applause was loud. Mark sat quietly as the sound filled the studio. Whoopi nodded. For the first time during the entire exchange, there was no visible disagreement between them. But then Whoopi said something that nobody expected. That's where I agree with you. Mark looked at her. She continued. People can change. Mark nodded. But, Whoopi added, the difficult part is proving it. Mark's expression became thoughtful. That's true. And that's why people ask questions. Mark nodded slowly. Maybe. Whoopi smiled. Maybe. Mark smiled back. Don't push your luck. The audience laughed again. But as the cameras pulled back slightly, the mood had changed. The conversation had started with a simple question about personal growth. It had moved into disagreement, then frustration, then something closer to understanding. But neither Mark nor Whoopi knew that the most difficult moment of the interview was still ahead. Because during the commercial break, something unexpected happened backstage. A producer approached the hosts with a message. The next segment had been changed. The network had received a question from viewers watching the broadcast. And it was about a subject that Mark had not expected to discuss at all. When the cameras came back from the break, Whoopi would have to decide whether to ask it, and Mark would have to decide whether to answer. Because this time, the question wasn't about fame. It wasn't about criticism. And it wasn't about whether celebrities should be held accountable. It was personal. Very personal. And if Whoopi asked it, the entire tone of the interview could change once again. The cameras came back on, and the studio lights seemed brighter than before. For a moment, the audience didn't know what to expect. The commercial break had given everyone a chance to breathe, but whatever tension had existed before had not completely disappeared. It was still there, quietly sitting beneath the surface of the conversation. Mark Wahlberg was back in his chair. Whoopi Goldberg was beside him. The other hosts were ready. But something had changed. Mark could sense it. The audience could sense it. And perhaps most importantly, Whoopi knew it. She had a question in front of her. A question that had come from viewers. A question that the producers had apparently decided was too important to ignore. Mark looked toward Whoopi. Okay, he said with a slight smile. Why does everybody look so serious? The audience laughed. Whoopi smiled. We're fine. That's what people say right before something happens. More laughter. Whoopi shook her head. Nothing is happening. Mark glanced toward the other hosts. Do you agree? One of the hosts laughed. Don't look at me. The audience laughed again. For a brief moment, the mood became lighter. But Whoopi was holding the question card. Mark noticed. His smile faded slightly. Okay, he said. Now I'm definitely worried. Whoopi looked down at the card, then back at him. This came from a viewer. That's never good. The audience laughed. Whoopi continued. They asked a question about something you've spoken about before. Mark nodded. Okay. And they want to know if you think your past should always be part of the conversation. The room became quiet. Mark's expression changed. It wasn't anger. It was recognition. He understood immediately where this was going. Whoopi continued. Do you think people should be allowed to move forward without constantly being reminded of who they used to be? Mark leaned back. He didn't answer right away. The audience waited. This was different from the earlier questions. This wasn't an abstract discussion about celebrity culture. This was about his own life, his own history, his own mistakes. And Mark knew it. He looked toward Whoopi. That's a complicated question. Whoopi nodded. Why? Because it depends on what we're talking about. Fair. Mark took a breath. If someone has done something serious, I don't think they should just pretend it never happened. The audience listened carefully. But, Mark continued, I also don't think a person should be defined forever by the worst thing they've ever done. Whoopi nodded. That's what you believe. Yes. Even when people don't believe you've changed? Mark looked at her. Yes. How do you convince them? Mark paused. I don't think you can convince everybody. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Mark continued. Some people will never change their opinion of you. You can spend your entire life trying to prove yourself to them, and they'll still see you the way they saw you 20 years ago. The audience remained silent. And at some point, he said, you have to accept that. Whoopi leaned slightly forward. But doesn't that make it easier for famous people to avoid accountability? Mark shook his head. No. Why not? Because accountability isn't the same as punishment. The audience reacted. Mark continued. If you admit what you did, take responsibility for it, learn from it, and spend your life trying to do better, that's accountability. Whoopi nodded. But what if people don't believe you? Then you keep doing better. And if they still don't believe you, you keep doing better. Mark's voice had become more confident. Because changing isn't something you do to make other people happy. You do it because you know you need to change. The audience applauded. Whoopi watched him carefully. There was something different in her expression now. The earlier tension had given way to genuine curiosity. But she wasn't finished. Do you think everyone deserves a second chance? Mark thought about it. Maybe not. The audience reacted with surprise. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. Really? Yes. Why? Because some things have consequences. Then where do you draw the line? I don't know if there is one line. That's a very convenient answer. Mark smiled. You're doing it again. The audience laughed. Whoopi smiled. Okay, fair. Mark continued. I think every situation is different. But I also think people should have the opportunity to show who they've become. Whoopi nodded. And if they make the same mistake again? Then people have every right to question whether they really changed. The audience murmured. Mark looked directly at Whoopi. That's the difference. Between what? Between saying you've changed and actually changing. The studio became quiet. Whoopi nodded slowly. That's true. Mark leaned forward. You can't just say you're different. Your actions have to prove it. Whoopi looked down at the card. Then she placed it on the table. For a second, Mark seemed relieved. But then Whoopi said something that immediately brought the tension back. Then let's talk about actions. Mark's expression changed. The audience became still. Whoopi continued. You said earlier that people shouldn't be defined by their past. Yes, but do you think the public has the right to look at someone's past when deciding whether they trust them? Mark nodded. Yes. Even years later? Yes. Then what's the difference? Mark looked confused. Between what? Between being judged by your past and being held accountable for your past. Mark paused. This was the question. The one that had been waiting underneath everything. He looked toward the audience. Then back at Whoopi. The difference is whether you're willing to listen to the whole story. Whoopi nodded. Explain. If you're going to judge someone based on something they did years ago, you should also look at what happened after. Mark's voice became more serious. Did they apologize? Did they change? Did they make an effort to repair the damage? Did they spend years doing things differently? He paused. That's part of the story, too. Whoopi nodded. I agree. Mark looked surprised. You agree? Yes. Okay. But, Whoopi continued, sometimes people don't want to hear the whole story. Mark smiled slightly. That's true. They want a simple answer. Exactly. And life isn't simple. No. The two looked at each other. For a moment, it felt like they had finally found common ground. Then Mark said something unexpected. That's why I don't like when people try to turn complicated issues into simple arguments. Whoopi's expression became serious. Neither do I. Because the second you do that, someone becomes the villain. And someone becomes the hero. Exactly. The audience applauded. The conversation seemed to be settling down. But then one of the other hosts entered the discussion. Can I ask something? Whoopi turned. Of course. The host looked toward Mark. You've talked about forgiveness, but what about people who say they don't owe celebrities forgiveness? Mark nodded. They don't. The audience reacted. Mark continued. Nobody owes anybody forgiveness. Whoopi looked at him. Not even you? Not even me. Why? Because forgiveness is personal. He paused. You can't demand that someone forgive you just because you apologized. The studio became quiet. But, Mark added, you can still apologize. Whoopi nodded. You can still take responsibility. Yes. You can still try to make things right. Absolutely. And you can still become a better person. That's the goal. The audience applauded again. Mark looked around the table. I think sometimes people confuse forgiveness with forgetting. Whoopi nodded. That's a good point. You can forgive someone and still remember what happened. Absolutely. And you can move forward without pretending the past never existed. The audience became silent. Mark's tone had changed. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was explaining something he genuinely believed. Whoopi seemed to recognize that. But then she asked the question that brought everything back to the original tension. If that's what you believe, why did you push back so hard when I challenged you earlier? Mark smiled. There was a pause. The audience laughed nervously. Mark looked down, then back up. Because I thought you were challenging my character. Whoopi nodded. And now? Now I think you were challenging my argument. The audience reacted. Whoopi smiled. There's a difference? Big difference. What changed? Mark thought for a moment. You. The audience laughed. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. Me? Yeah. How? You explained what you meant. Whoopi nodded. And you listened. Mark smiled. Eventually. The audience laughed. The tension finally began to dissolve. But it wasn't completely gone. Because Mark had one more thing to say. I think that's the problem with a lot of conversations today. Whoopi turned toward him. What problem? People hear one sentence and decide they know everything about you. The audience quieted. One clip, Mark continued. One headline. One quote taken out of context. He shook his head. Suddenly, everybody knows what you believe. Whoopi nodded. That's true. And sometimes, Mark said, you don't even get the chance to explain yourself. Whoopi looked toward the audience. That's the world we live in. Mark nodded. Exactly. Then one of the panelists asked. But doesn't that also happen because celebrities don't always speak honestly? Mark looked toward her. Sometimes. Then isn't the public partly responsible for demanding clarity? Yes. Even if the questions are uncomfortable? Yes. Mark paused. But there's a difference between demanding clarity and demanding a specific answer. The room became silent. Whoopi looked at him. That's what you think happened today? Mark hesitated. The question caught him off guard. He could have avoided it. He could have smiled. He could have made a joke. Instead, he answered honestly. At the beginning. The audience reacted. Whoopi nodded slowly. At the beginning? Yes. And now? Mark looked at her. Now I think we're having a conversation. Whoopi smiled. Good. Mark smiled back. Good. For a few seconds, everything seemed settled. The audience applauded. The hosts appeared relaxed. Mark leaned back. Whoopi looked toward the camera. But then Mark raised his hand. Wait. Whoopi turned. What? I have a question for you. The audience immediately reacted. Laughter and applause filled the studio. Whoopi smiled. Oh no. Mark laughed. Fair is fair. You're not the host. I know. Then why are you asking me questions? Because you've been asking me questions for the last hour. The audience laughed loudly. Whoopi shook her head. Fine. Mark leaned forward. His expression became serious. What do you think? Whoopi looked confused. About what? About forgiveness. The studio became quiet again. Mark continued. You've been asking me whether people deserve second chances. Whether people can change. Whether the past should follow them. He paused. What do you believe? Whoopi stared at him. For once, she didn't immediately have an answer. The audience waited. Mark remained silent. Whoopi finally spoke. I think people can change. Mark nodded. But I also think, she continued, that when you've hurt someone, you don't get to decide when they're ready to move on. Mark's expression became thoughtful. Whoopi continued. You can change. You can apologize. You can spend years trying to be better. But you can't force someone else to trust you. Mark nodded slowly. I agree. And I think that's the hard part. What's the hard part? Accepting that your change doesn't erase someone else's experience. The studio became completely silent. Mark looked down. Then he looked back at Whoopi. That's fair. Whoopi nodded. That's my answer. Mark smiled. Good answer. The audience applauded. The exchange had come full circle. What began as a tense disagreement about questions and assumptions had transformed into something far more meaningful. But there was still one moment left. Because as the show approached its final minutes, the producer suddenly signaled to Whoopi. Time was running out. Whoopi looked at Mark. Mark looked back. She smiled. One last question. Mark immediately laughed. Again, the audience burst into laughter. Whoopi raised her hands. This really is the last one. Okay. Whoopi leaned forward. After everything we've talked about today, do you regret pushing back on me? The laughter disappeared. The question was simple, but it carried everything that had happened during the interview. The tension, the disagreement, the accusations, the misunderstandings, the moments of laughter, the unexpected moments of agreement. Mark sat quietly. Then he smiled. No. The audience reacted. Whoopi raised her eyebrows. No. Why? Because I think you needed to hear what I was saying. The audience murmured. Mark continued. And I needed to hear what you were saying. Whoopi nodded. Mark looked directly at her. I don't regret pushing back. He paused. But I also don't regret listening. The audience erupted in applause. Whoopi smiled. And for the first time all morning, there was no tension between them. Just understanding. But as the applause continued, Mark noticed something. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still reacting. And the conversation that had seemed like a simple daytime interview only hours earlier was already beginning to take on a life of its own. Because somewhere outside that studio, viewers were watching. Clips were being recorded. Screenshots were being taken. And people were already preparing to debate what they had just witnessed. Some would say Mark had every right to push back. Others would argue that Whoopi had simply been doing her job. Some would praise the conversation for remaining respectful. Others would focus on the moments of tension. And by the time the final camera faded out, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The interview wasn't going to end when the broadcast ended. It was only beginning, because the next morning, the internet would be talking. And Mark Wahlberg's decision to push back against Whoopi Goldberg would become the center of a much larger conversation about celebrity interviews, accountability, forgiveness, and whether famous people should be expected to answer for every chapter of their past. And somewhere inside the studio, as the lights began to dim, Mark and Whoopi exchanged one final look. No anger, no hostility, just the quiet recognition that they had disagreed, challenged each other, and somehow managed to walk away having heard something neither had expected. But outside those studio walls, the story was already changing. And the reaction waiting for them was about to be far more explosive than anything that had happened on the stage. The cameras were off. The audience had begun to leave their seats. The bright studio lights slowly faded into the ordinary glow of a television set preparing for its next segment. Crew members moved across the floor, producers spoke quietly into headsets, and the hosts began their usual post-show routines. But something about the room still felt different. The conversation between Mark Wahlberg and Whoopi Goldberg was over. At least officially. But everyone who had been inside that studio knew the moment would not end there. Mark stood near the edge of the stage, speaking briefly with members of the production team. He appeared calm. Relaxed, even. Whoopi was nearby. The two eventually crossed paths. For a second, there was silence. Then Whoopi smiled. You survived. Mark laughed. Barely. The audience members who were still nearby laughed. Mark shook his head. I thought I was coming here to talk about a movie. You did. At some point. Whoopi smiled. Eventually. The exchange was light. Friendly. But beneath the humor was an understanding that something unusual had happened. Neither had planned for the conversation to become so serious. Neither had expected the interview to turn into a discussion about forgiveness, accountability, public judgment, and the right of people to change. And neither could have known how quickly the conversation would spread once viewers began sharing clips online. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, viewers began posting their reactions. One short clip showed Mark pushing back against the idea that celebrities should automatically be treated as guilty simply because they were famous. Another captured Whoopi questioning whether people who claim to have changed should also be willing to accept difficult questions about their past. A third clip showed the moment when Mark told Whoopi that criticism didn't automatically make someone right. That particular exchange quickly became one of the most discussed moments. Some viewers applauded Mark. They argued that he had remained respectful while standing up for himself. They praised the way he refused to become defensive or aggressive. One viewer wrote that Mark had finally said what many guests probably think but rarely say out loud. Another argued that Whoopi had pushed too hard. Others disagreed completely. They believed Whoopi was simply doing what a talk show host is supposed to do. Ask difficult questions. Challenge the guest. Keep the conversation moving. To those viewers, Mark's response was unnecessary. They believed he had taken a normal interview question and turned it into something more dramatic than it needed to be. And then there were those who saw something else entirely. They didn't see a winner. They didn't see a loser. They saw two people having a difficult conversation. One that became uncomfortable. One that included disagreement. But one that ultimately ended with both sides listening. That group focused on the final exchange. When Whoopi asked Mark whether he regretted pushing back. And Mark answered no. But then he added that he also didn't regret listening. That line became one of the most shared moments of the fictional interview, because it captured the entire conversation in a single thought. You can disagree with someone. You can challenge them. You can defend yourself. And still listen. Still learn. Still walk away without turning the disagreement into hatred. But the internet rarely agrees on anything. And as the clips continued circulating, the debate became more intense. Some viewers accused the show of deliberately creating confrontation for ratings. Others defended the hosts, saying that difficult conversations were exactly what daytime television should be willing to have. Some viewers focused on Mark's words. Others focused on Whoopi's. And a completely different conversation began developing around the subject of forgiveness. The question was no longer simply whether Mark had pushed back against Whoopi. It became something much bigger. Can people really change? Should the public allow them to move forward? How long should someone be defined by their past? And who gets to decide when a person has done enough to prove that they are different? Those questions spread far beyond the original interview. Social media users began debating them. Comment sections filled with arguments. Short videos appeared with dramatic captions. People replayed the same moments again and again. Some viewers believed Mark had delivered a powerful message about second chances. Others believed Whoopi had delivered the more important message. That changing yourself doesn't automatically erase the experience of someone who was hurt by your past actions. And perhaps the most interesting part was that both arguments could exist at the same time. That was what made the fictional conversation so compelling. There was no simple winner. No obvious villain. No perfect answer. Just two people approaching the subject from different perspectives. Mark was arguing that people should be allowed to grow. Whoopi was reminding him that growth doesn't erase consequences. And somewhere between those two ideas was the complicated truth that real life rarely fits into a simple headline. The following morning, the interview became a topic of discussion across entertainment media. Commentators replayed the clips. Talk show analysts debated the exchange. Some called it one of the most unexpectedly tense interviews of the season. Others described it as a surprisingly respectful disagreement. A few commentators suggested that Mark's calm approach had made his words more powerful. Instead of shouting, he remained composed. Instead of attacking Whoopi personally, he challenged the assumptions behind her questions. And instead of walking away when the conversation became uncomfortable, he stayed. That detail mattered, because the easiest thing for either person would have been to shut the conversation down. Mark could have dismissed the questions. Whoopi could have moved on to another topic. The producers could have cut to a commercial. But none of them did. They continued, and that allowed the conversation to evolve. Still, not everyone was satisfied. Some viewers believed Mark should have been more direct. Others thought Whoopi should have apologized for the way certain questions were framed. A few online commentators claimed that the entire exchange was unnecessarily confrontational. But even those critics agreed on one thing. The interview had gotten people talking. And in the world of television, that can be powerful. The fictional clip continued spreading. People began creating reaction videos. Others discussed their favorite moments. Some focused on the humorous parts. Others focused on the serious discussion about forgiveness. One particular phrase appeared repeatedly. Changing doesn't erase the past. Another appeared just as often. People shouldn't be trapped by their past forever. Two statements. Two perspectives. Both powerful. Both complicated. And perhaps that was the real reason the conversation resonated. Because almost everyone understands what it feels like to be judged. And almost everyone understands what it feels like to question someone else's actions. The debate wasn't really about celebrities. Not entirely. It was about people. About mistakes. About growth. About whether someone can become a better version of themselves. And about whether the world is willing to recognize that change. Back at the studio, the day continued. The show moved on to other guests. Other stories. Other conversations. But the Mark and Whoopi exchange remained the subject everyone was talking about behind the scenes. One producer reportedly described the interview as something that wasn't supposed to happen. Not because the conversation was planned to become explosive, but because the most memorable moments weren't scripted. They came from two people responding honestly to each other. That was the strange thing about live television. You could prepare every question. You could organize every segment. You could plan every transition. But you couldn't completely control what happened once two people sat across from each other and started talking. And sometimes, the most memorable television came from those moments that nobody expected. By the end of the day, the fictional debate had reached millions of viewers. The original question had been simple. What happens when a celebrity pushes back against a host? But the answer turned out to be more complicated. Sometimes pushing back creates conflict. Sometimes it creates understanding. Sometimes it does both. Mark had pushed back because he felt that some of the questions carried assumptions. Whoopi had continued asking because she believed difficult questions deserved honest answers. Neither completely surrendered their position. And perhaps they didn't need to, because the conversation didn't end with one person defeating the other. It ended with both acknowledging that disagreement could exist without destroying respect. That was the message that many viewers took away. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone was satisfied. But people were talking. And sometimes, that is exactly what a meaningful conversation is supposed to do. As the fictional story came to an end, the final image was not of an angry argument. It was something quieter. The studio after the cameras had stopped. The audience gone. The lights dimmed. The stage almost empty. And two people who had spent an hour challenging each other, now standing on opposite sides of the same conversation. Mark had defended the possibility of change. Whoopi had defended the importance of accountability. And somewhere between those two positions, a strange kind of understanding had emerged. Not agreement. Understanding. Because maybe the real lesson wasn't that Mark was right. And maybe it wasn't that Whoopi was right. Maybe it was that difficult conversations don't always need winners. Sometimes they simply need people willing to stay in the conversation long enough to hear each other. And that was why the fictional interview continued to live online. Viewers could disagree about the questions. They could disagree about the answers. They could argue about who handled the moment better. But they couldn't deny that something unexpected had happened. A routine celebrity appearance had become a conversation about the complicated relationship between public judgment and personal growth. And perhaps the most powerful moment came at the very end. Not when Mark pushed back. Not when Whoopi challenged him. Not when the audience reacted. But when both sides finally recognized something important. You can defend yourself without refusing to listen. You can ask difficult questions without assuming you already know the answer. And you can disagree with someone while still respecting them. That is what made the moment so memorable. Not the tension, not the controversy, but the fact that, after everything, the conversation continued. And now the question goes to you. Do you think Mark was right to push back against Whoopi's questions? Or do you think Whoopi was simply doing her job by challenging him? Did Mark make a strong point about forgiveness and personal growth? Or did Whoopi have the better argument about accountability and consequences? Share your opinion in the comments below, because this is the kind of conversation where everyone may see the same moment differently. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight for more explosive and dramatic stories, unexpected celebrity moments, and intense talk show encounters. Like this video, share it with someone who enjoys dramatic storytelling, and let us know what you think. Because sometimes the most unforgettable moments aren't the ones where someone wins. They're the ones where two people disagree, the entire room goes silent, and everyone watching is left with a question of their own.